When working with large amounts of data, we often need to simplify or summarize the dataset in order to gain insights from it. In SQL, this can be achieved by using a combination of aggregate functions and grouping. CrateDB supports both of these concepts, and we'll explore them in this video using our Chicago taxi rides table. Let's dive in. Here, I've connected to my CrateDB cluster with the Crash CLI. The first thing to do is find out how many records are in our taxi rides table. This query tells us that there are 245,000 records. These are all of the rides for the month of April 2024. We've actually already started using aggregations here. The count function is a good example of a simple aggregation. It returns a single summary value telling us how many rows are in the table. With this much information available, the value of data contained in a single row is often less important than the insights gained from looking at a summary of some metric applied to all or some of the rows. Let's dig in further and see how CrateDB can help us understand the data in this table. Here's the schema for our taxi rides table. The total cost column contains data about the total dollar cost of each taxi ride, made up from the base fare plus any tips, tolls, and extras. Using aggregate functions, we can work out what the average total cost of a taxi ride was. And we can see that the average amount paid was around $25.73. The average aggregation function only considers values that are not null. So we don't need to add an extra clause to our SQL statement to exclude these from the calculation.